Remember when a British horror film was so despised by its own studio that the executive who controlled it called it one of the 10 worst films he'd ever seen, then buried the print, locked the director out of the editing room, and used the whole production as a weapon to fire the producer who made it? That executive later won an Oscar for The Deer Hunter. The film he threw in the bin became the Citizen Kane of horror. Directed by Robin Hardy, written by Anthony Shaffer, and starring Edward Woodward as a rigidly devout police sergeant who arrives on a remote Scottish island to find a missing girl and instead finds something that will cost him everything, with Christopher Lee, Britt Ekland, Diane Cilento, and Ingrid Pitt rounding out the cast. The Wicker Man took a simple missing person premise and detonated it into a pagan ritual nightmare that nobody in British cinema saw coming. 50 years on, it is still the most unsettling film to ever be set in broad daylight. Today we're counting down 15 weird facts about The Wicker Man. Stick around for fact number 1, because the man who tried hardest to destroy this film accidentally gave it the one thing it needed to survive. Hit that like button, subscribe, and drop a comment, first-time viewer or lifelong obsessive. Either one belongs here. Now, let's get into it. Production designer Seamus Flannery built it from actual wicker, actual timber, actual green boughs, 18 feet of it, standing on a cliff top above the Solway Firth. The brief was simple. It needed to hold livestock, one police sergeant, and be set on fire in front of multiple cameras. Flannery's team tested it first, to understand how quickly it would take, in which direction, with how much heat. The test worked exactly as advertised, completely, instantly, irreversibly. The structure burned to nothing before a single frame of the finale had been filmed. The replacement went up under brutal time pressure with the same crew, on the same deadline, with almost zero margin. And here is the detail that reframes everything you feel watching the final sequence. It was filmed in a single continuous multi-camera pass. One attempt, no safety net. If a camera failed, if the wind turned, if Woodward missed a position, it was gone. Director Robin Hardy later revealed there were actually 3 Wicker Men built across the production, each serving different purposes, different scales, different shots. The one that burned in the climax was the hero structure, the only one that mattered, and they only lit it once. What you're watching in those final minutes is the sole surviving record of an event that couldn't be repeated. The film is set in spring. It was shot in October and November, not a blossom in sight anywhere in Galloway. Robin Hardy's solution for most of the production was to physically glue artificial leaves and blossoms to trees wherever they were filming, a process he described as maddening and continuous, with trucks following the crew carrying fake foliage to be pinned to branches before every exterior shot. They did this across 25 different locations. For the aerial footage, though, the sweeping shots of the lush island paradise that Howie flies toward at the start of the film, gluing blossom to that many trees, was genuinely impossible. So Hardy used footage he'd shot in South Africa while directing a commercial there. The verdant, flowering landscape that tells you this is a fertile, abundant, sun-blessed place, filmed on another continent. The island that looks too good to be real is literally that. It's a different country, stitched invisibly into Scotland. Hardy never flagged this in interviews until years later. Almost nobody noticed. Post-production on The Wicker Man was a 3-month siege at Shepperton Studios, and it broke Robin Hardy physically. He had come straight off a punishing October-November Scottish shoot, outdoor temperatures, failing light, 25 locations, a crew making decisions in real time under impossible conditions. Then came the editing room, where the pressure intensified rather than eased, because British Lion had just been acquired by EMI mid-production, and the new executives were making clear they had no interest in what Hardy had made. Hardy suffered a heart attack during the edit. His editor, Eric Boyd Perkins, had to get him to hospital. He came back and finished the cut. Then EMI locked him out of the building entirely. Hardy, producer Peter Snell, and everyone else connected to the original production were physically barred from re-entering the studio. The film they'd made was no longer theirs in any practical sense. Hardy had a heart attack making The Wicker Man, recovered, finished it, and then watched it taken from him without any legal recourse whatsoever. When British Lion was absorbed into EMI, Michael Dealey came in as head of production. He watched Hardy's cut. Christopher Lee, who had worked for free, who considered this the finest role of his career, went to Dealey personally to advocate for the film. Dealey told him it was one of the 10 worst films he had ever seen. Just said it, to his face. Lee repeated that line in interviews for the rest of his life with barely contained fury. Dealey went on to produce The Deer Hunter, then Blade Runner. He won an Academy Award for Best Picture. By any commercial measure, one of the most successful producers British cinema ever produced. And he looked at The Wicker Man and saw garbage. Here's what makes that extraordinary. Everything that almost killed the film, The cut, the burial, the double bill dump, the deteriorating print flows from a single judgment made in a screening room in 1973. One man, one verdict, that's all it took. Britt Ekland was Rod Stewart's girlfriend by the time The Wicker Man was heading toward release. Stewart had seen the footage, specifically what he understood to be Ekland appearing fully nude in the seduction sequence. His response, according to the film's American promoter Sterling Smith, was to offer significant money to suppress the release. Some accounts describe it more specifically, an attempt to acquire the negatives and have them destroyed entirely. Stewart himself later dismissed the story as myth-making. What isn't disputed is that Ekland's nude appearance in the film, or what appeared to be her nude appearance, caused a real and documented attempt at suppression. The particular irony here is that the truly explicit footage wasn't even Ekland. She had refused full nudity, was pregnant during filming, and had left the set before the body double sequences were shot. Rod Stewart was apparently willing to spend serious money to destroy footage of a woman who wasn't Britt Ekland. Ekland had agreed to appear topless from the waist up and nothing further. That was the deal. She filmed her portion of the seduction sequence and left. Director Robin Hardy then brought in Lorraine Peters, an exotic dancer, to cover the remaining angles, the ones Ekland had explicitly refused. Peters was fitted with a blonde wig. The footage was shot while Ekland was absent 2 days later. When Ekland found out, she described being devastated, not because the footage existed, but because Hardy had made her a promise and broken it the moment she turned her back. To this day, she refuses to sign photographs from the sequence, pointing out to fans that the image they're holding isn't her. One further detail from production records: according to those involved, Peters was menstruating during the filming of those scenes. Nobody thought this was worth mentioning at the time. It was a different era. Inside the burning Wicker Man, above Woodward's head, sat a terrified goat named Touchwood. The goat was a local mascot from the area. When the flames started and Touchwood became understandably distressed, it relieved itself directly onto Woodward below. Hardy recalled the incident with some amusement, noting that whenever the goat's owner called the animal's name, Touchwood, the crew interpreted it as the instruction to ignite the structure and scrambled accordingly. Woodward later described the day as the most frightening of his 6-decade career, not because of the fire, but because he had broken a toe the previous day being dragged barefoot up the hillside and was in genuine pain throughout the sequence. The cue cards for his final speech had to be erected at the last minute because a schedule change had moved the scene forward, and he hadn't had time to memorize the biblical text. He delivered one of the most anguished performances in British cinema, in pain, being urinated on by a goat reading from giant cards. The script gave Woodward the bones of the final sequence, the detail that lifts it from horrifying to genuinely unbearable, how he's singing Psalm 23 as the flames take hold, the specific prayer he delivers in his final moments. That was Woodward's own contribution. He proposed it to Hardy, and Hardy immediately agreed. The prayer Howie recites is adapted from the words Sir Walter Raleigh delivered on the scaffold before his execution in 1618. Raleigh, soldier, explorer, poet, condemned man, spoke those words knowing they were his last. Woodward chose them specifically because he understood that Howie needed to die as a man of complete faith, not as a man broken by what was happening to him. The theological precision of that choice, a devout Christian in his final moments, reaching for the words of another man who faced execution with grace, is what makes the sequence feel true rather than theatrical. Nobody in the audience knew the Raleigh connection. Woodward never made a point of explaining it publicly. He just did it. If that last fact just reframed the ending of this film for you entirely, and it should, drop a comment below. Which hits harder watching the finale, the singing, or the silence after? Cast your vote down there and subscribe while you're at it. Alright, back to Summerreel. 7 facts left and they only get stranger. Paul Giovanni was an American playwright, actor, director, and musician from Atlantic City. Robin Hardy found him after seeing his work on a Shakespeare production in New York, specifically his instinct for folding electric instrumentation into traditional acoustic arrangements. Giovanni wrote every note of the Wicker Man score, performed much of it himself, and assembled the musicians under the band name Magnet specifically for the film. Songs like Willow's Song and Gently Johnny have been analyzed by musicologists, covered by dozens of artists, and cited as foundational texts of an entire musical subculture. Giovanni never made another film score. The Wicker Man was his only significant film credit. He returned to theater work, directing on Broadway, and died in New York in June 1990 of AIDS-related illness. The soundtrack wasn't officially released until 1998, 8 years after his death. He never heard it on record. He composed one of the most discussed film scores in British cinema history and died before the world knew what it had. Diane Cilento, who played Miss Rose, the island's schoolteacher and high priestess, was not simply playing a character. She claimed at the time of filming and consistently afterward to be a practicing white witch. When it came to the fire leap sequence, Cilento didn't just perform it, she personally assisted in choreographing it, bringing her own understanding of the ritual's purpose and physical requirements to the staging. She also designed the tarot cards that appear on the ceiling of the Green Man Inn, artwork she had created for an actual personal tarot deck. One of those cards depicts her son Jason, naked on a horse. The son, incidentally, was Jason Connery, Sean Connery's son, from their marriage. The pagan sequences in the Wicker Man feel inhabited rather than performed because the woman running them actually believed in what she was doing. Nobody hired a consultant, they just accidentally cast one. Producer Peter Snell brought the Wicker Man into existence. He greenlit it, protected it, kept it alive during the shoot. When British Lion was sold to EMI mid-production, incoming executives Michael Dealey and Barry Spikings needed to clear Snell out. He stood between them and a cleaner acquisition, so they used the film. According to Robin Hardy's account in BFI's Sight and Sound, The Wicker Man was something with which they could beat Peter Snell. It was presented unfavorably, wielded as evidence of poor commercial judgment, and used to justify removing him. March 1973, surplus to requirements, gone. The film that Hardy, Schaffer, and Lee had built without upfront pay, the film Snell had fought to make, became the instrument of his own professional destruction. Then Hardy, Snell, and everyone else connected to the original production were physically locked out of Shepperton. They couldn't even enter the building. The movie ate the man who made it possible. Britt Ekland was not subtle about her feelings regarding Galloway, Scotland, in November 1972. She described Dumfries and Galloway, the landscape that forms the visual backbone of the entire film, as the most dismal place in creation. Said it publicly, on the record, in front of local press. The production was subsequently forced to issue a formal apology to local newspapers on her behalf. The Scottish communities whose farms, pubs, and residents make up everything that feels real about Summerall, the same people Hardy had recruited as extras, the farmers and shopkeepers whose faces give the island its texture, read their landscape dismissed by one of the film's stars. One of the most beloved fictional locations in British cinema was described as unbearable by one of the people paid to stand in it. The apology was issued, the film was made, and Galloway still looks exactly like Summerisle ought to look, with or without Britt Ekland's approval. Producer Peter Snell had a replica of the Wicker Man structure erected on the Promenade de la Croisette in Cannes during the 1973 film festival, positioned directly in front of the Carlton Hotel. The film had entered the marché, the non-competitive commercial market, and Snell needed attention. The statue got it. Roger Corman saw it, asked to see the film, and eventually acquired the American distribution rights as a result. What happened to the statue itself is disputed. Some accounts say Michael Dealey had it taken down immediately. Others say it was ceremonially set on fire. Nobody agrees. What is certain is this: the statue worked. It brought the film its only real American deal. Then it vanished. No record, no photographs, no confirmation of its fate. A giant burning effigy was erected on the most photographed boulevard in world cinema, generated the one commercial outcome that kept the film in circulation, and disappeared without a trace. The Wicker Man claimed another one. Anthony Schaefer and Peter Snell had a specific type in mind for Howie: British, authoritative, capable of projecting genuine moral conviction without tipping into parody. Their first call was David Hemmings, blow-up peak profile. He turned it down. Second choice, Michael York. York passed. A third name, Peter Cushing, was in early discussions. Think about that for a second. Cushing spent his entire career playing men of fierce moral conviction, standing against forces of darkness. He would have been extraordinary. He went elsewhere. Woodward was not the first choice, the second choice, or the third. He was the man who said yes when everyone else had walked. And here's what none of those casting decisions could have predicted: the private religious faith Woodward brought to the role, the thing that makes Howie's final scream feel true rather than performed, was completely invisible on paper. No audition finds that. It was an accident of availability. 3 actors left a gap. Woodward stepped into it and did something none of them could have done. Michael Dealey looked at The Wicker Man in a screening room in 1973 and told Christopher Lee, directly in those words, that it was one of the 10 worst films he'd ever seen. He then used it to remove the producer who made it, cut it without the director's consent, dumped it without advertising, and allowed the print to deteriorate into near oblivion. The following year, Dealey produced The Man Who Fell to Earth. 2 years after that, The Deer Hunter. In 1978, he won the Academy Award for Best Picture. In 1981, he produced Blade Runner. His commercial instincts were, by every conventional measure, exceptional. He just couldn't see the Wicker Man. And here is the thing that keeps this fact alive 50 years later. Everything Dealey did to suppress the film, the cuts, the burial, the double bill dump, the neglect of the print, generated the mythology. The scarcity created the cult. The cult created the restoration. The restoration created the audience. Dealey tried to kill it and instead made it immortal. The man who understood cinema better than almost anyone alive in 1973 committed the greatest act of accidental preservation in British film history. So there you have it. 15 weird facts about The Wicker Man, a film whose director had a heart attack making it, whose composer died before the soundtrack was even released, whose producer was destroyed by it, and whose villain accidentally guaranteed its survival. Christopher Lee spent the rest of his life calling it the finest thing he'd ever done. He worked for free. He never received meaningful payment. He didn't care. That's how much the film mattered. Share this with whoever first made you sit through the ending of The Wicker Man. The person who looked at you afterward and said nothing because nothing needed to be said. They knew exactly what they'd done to you. And until next time, stay off the island in May.